Doing experiments on people has a dark history. Today, if you're participating in a research study, you can expect to be informed of your rights and the responsibilities of the researchers. They must inform you what they're going to do and get your consent. Researchers themselves have to go through hours of training on ethical protocols. All of these levels of protection for human subjects were only formalized in the 1970s. If you go back to World War II, we have human experimentation during the Holocaust and in concentration camps. And there's also experimentation on prisoners of war in Japan at the same time. The Tuskegee experiment, these were all studies that put people's bodies at risk, and they had no say in what was happening to them. Researchers who weren't committing human rights violations at the time were usually just experimenting on themselves, or in some cases, friends and family, students, which was neither very safe nor very rigorous. But in the early 1950s, the U.S. National Institutes of Health set out to do something unprecedented. They wanted to start studying humans on a grand scale. They had a lot of resources after what Congress saw as clear contributions to the war effort. They coordinated research between universities, supported breakthroughs like mass production of penicillin, and they got a big boost in funding.
So in Bethesda, Maryland, there was a small set of researchers who were realizing that they had pretty much everything in place. They had the building, they had recruited all of these amazing researchers. They had most of the materials they needed to get their research done.
This is Laura Stark, a history professor at the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University.
It was the healthy human bodies that they didn't have.
The NIH needed normal, healthy humans for many reasons. They needed controls to compare with sick people when trying a new intervention. They also wanted to get a better handle on the physiology of the human body based on normal subjects.
That was really what researchers were trying to do, just seeing how the body metabolizes things, for example.
But again, there were these horrible recent precedents for research on human subjects. Fortunately for NIH, two peace churches had the opposite problem: too many healthy human volunteers. The Mennonites and the Church of the Brethren were full of conscientious objectors who needed an alternative way to serve.
And it was almost this perfect storm in a few months of 1952 when they came together and the churches signed an agreement that said that they would make available as placements being a normal control at the National Institutes of Health. And that was the beginning of it. The first contract signed in 1954.
Laura Stark actually wrote a book about this project. And with her help, the Science Podcast is bringing you a 3-part series we're calling The Normals. It's the story of truly voluntary human research subjects brought together by 2 peace churches and 1 giant scientific institution. What could possibly go wrong? One thing you have to understand is that when World War II ended, the draft continued on and off into the 1970s. In the 40s and 50s, religious objectors needed to find another way to serve besides going to war.
The perception of being a religious objector, what would be eventually called a conscientious objector, in sort of mainstream American public view was that it was something frowned upon, embarrassing, and shameful.
In surveys at the time, when the public was asked about their view of objectors,
all of the options for what you thought about a conscientious objector was on a scale of cowardliness. So do you think they're very cowardly, not very cowardly, or completely cowardly?
the peace churches had a system in place to provide positions for people objecting to the draft when they needed a place to serve.
We were given a special dispensation by the draft board that we could do alternative work rather than be in the military.
That was Dale Horst. He grew up in a Mennonite community and was one of the very first normal controls recruited by NIH in June 1954.
I had not really thought about, the draft board and that I had to do 2 years of service until a friend came up to me after church one morning. He said, well, why don't we volunteer and do this now rather than get started with some kind of work and then have that interrupted by 2 years of service. I was about to graduate, and it didn't appear that I was going to be going to college. So I said, well, okay, we can do that while it gives me some time to think about what I want to do.
Dale and his friend volunteered to become part of the Mennonite Central Committee Voluntary Service, which meant they would get some kind of placement. They headed over to an orientation center in Pennsylvania.
I was looking at the list of places that I could work and being a little disappointed, frankly, because nothing looked all that exciting.
What were some of the disappointing options that you were like, nah?
I think working in hospitals or state mental hospital were something that I couldn't imagine myself doing. And then they said, come to a meeting room on Tuesday, and there are going to be people from the National Institutes of Health. And that was the first time that they had were involved with the NIH. And so I went to that meeting and I knew immediately that that's where I was going to go because obviously it was a place of science. It was filled with scientists, and that was very important to me at the time. They were talking about a specific program in the National Institute of Mental Health. And that program had to do with the study of LSD. LSD was fairly new at that time, and they had a program of studying the effects of LSD on the human mind.
Signing up for the voluntary service meant moving into the clinical center at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. Dale was to live there for months, if not years, getting experimented on for basically little or no compensation. He was under a procurement contract rather than an employee. Dale and his friend drove down to Bethesda in June 1954.
It was a huge building. I don't know if you've ever been to the NIH, but the clinical center was touted at the time as the largest brick building in the world.
Wow.
It was 14 stories high and just huge. After we passed through the paperwork and things of being admitted, then they took us to the patient unit, which turned out to be a locked unit. Nobody had talked about us being locked in, actually. That was a little surprising to us and kind of a nuisance, frankly. Every time you wanted to come and go, you had to ask somebody to unlock the door.
After settling into the clinical center, Dale and the other normals started getting involved in the experiments. Here's a typical LSD experiment that Dale remembers.
They would take us after breakfast, then we would go to a treatment room and get our shot. And then we would go back to our room and wait. The drug would begin to act rather slowly, actually. And you'd sort of feel these waves of having a different world of consciousness until it began to just take over your mind completely. And then at maybe after an hour, they would take us to a lab and they would have us do certain procedures. They would put us in the dark and then they would have a rapidly flickering light. And at some point, it flickers so fast that it looks like it was on all the time. You'd sit there and look at light for what seemed endless amounts of time. And sometimes it seemed like they were deliberately doing it a long time to torture us. And actually, one time I can remember saying, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. So they talked to me for a minute and then we went back to our usual study.
In between studies, the normals ended up having a lot of time to do just whatever they wanted.
After they give you a drug, it takes a certain amount of time for that drug to clear the body. And so it wasn't something they could do every day. In fact, I think they limited our drug studies to 2 or at most 3 days a week.
Here's part of a letter Dale wrote to a friend in September 1955. Hello, how's my old buddy doing? I'm doing just great. Things are buzzing right along here. I got a mumps shot in my arm this afternoon. It's stiff as an old board. In case I don't finish this letter today, don't worry, I'll complete it tomorrow. Well, here it is, Saturday already. Guess what I did this afternoon? Yup, I started in the barber business. Haircuts were up to $1.50 here last week. I never cut a head of hair in my life, but I talked Lauren Aiden into letting me try. He walked out into the day room before I could clean up the floor. 3 other fellows came in for a haircut. Carl was my second customer. He kept jumping around until I almost cut his ear off. 5 different people cut mine. It looks like, what a mess. I have to live in my room for a week. Dale stayed on at the NIH for 2 years, mostly as a normal control in mental health experiments.
They had us spend time on a psychiatrist's couch. They would say whatever comes to your mind. And that was a totally different experience from anything I had ever experienced before.
Nobody just wanted to hear you talk.
No. Sometimes it was just really difficult to think of things, to say.
Many of the experiments Dale was in used LSD. Their aim was curing schizophrenia. The idea was that if you could induce these schizophrenia-like symptoms in a person that was a normal, healthy human control, you might better understand how the disease came about in the first place.
This was the beginning of what I consider real mental health research. They were thought that if they looked at the effects of these drugs, then they would understand more about schizophrenia. That was the big goal. In fact, one of the lead investigators told me at one time that he appreciated what we were doing because in 5 years we would understand schizophrenia. Now, he was a little optimistic.
Yeah, I would say
Yes.
we're not there.
One of the really interesting things is that voluntary service for the Church of the Brethren and for the Mennonite Church was open to women. When people were coming in as normals, there weren't only conscientious objectors, there were women and also men who simply wanted to have this service experience.
My good friend Jackie, we together thought this would be a good idea.
This is Shirley Burry Gessinger. She was a normal during the summer of 1957.
I have to admit, even though I grew up in a very small town, it was very nice. It was a very small world. And I was very ready to look beyond Ohio and see what else was out there.
How old were you?
I was only 18. After my freshman year in college, reflecting back on that, I seemed to be very young. I didn't feel particularly that way, but I was. My mother had to sign a consent form, and I did too. And there was no hesitation about doing that.
Shirley and Jackie took advantage of their friend having a car there, not only to get a ride down, but to spend their downtime as normal controls exploring the capital city.
I did things like I rented a sewing machine and made a little dress for my first niece. So, I did that kind of thing. I didn't feel at all homesick. I was totally, I think, into what we were doing and just eager to find out what this was going to be like.
While Dale's experiments tended to focus on LSD during his 2 years as an NIH normal, Shirley actually was exposed to more than 20 drugs in her 3 months as a normal control. Shirley also participated in sleep deprivation experiments.
So that was actually the toughest part, the sleep deprivation. We stayed awake for 75 hours. And then we were also given a drug during that time. I'm not going to say all these right. Chlorpromazine, this was an antipsychotic, phenobarbital, barbiturates, dextroamphetamine sulfate, which is a psychostimulant, Benactazine, antidepressant, can cause delirium and hallucinogenic effects, ethyl alcohol, atropine sulfate, protracin, ACTH, and also lysergic acid, which is LSD.
The normals weren't only used at the Mental Health Institute. They were also studied by folks doing metabolic research, heart research. That means things like electrolytes, respiration, a lot of it using radioactive tracers. Here's Laura Stark talking about some of the more interesting experiments that she heard about as she interviewed over 100 normals for her book.
A lot of the metabolic research was oriented towards, of course, domestic issues, but also around national security and the ongoing wars that the US was involved in. So the sweat studies were metabolic studies.
So picture a normal human volunteer in some kind of hot room, laying in a hammock, having all of their fluids collected. And it was very uncomfortable to lie there sweating, basically doing nothing.
And the researchers knew it was pretty hard and that they needed moral support because if the people dropped out, they would lose their data. And so the Mennonite and the Church of the Brethren people who were there, they were there as sets of friends or sort of all on the same team. So the researchers would go and get one of their friends and have them cheer them on.
There were some people who were interested in psychosomatic illness, and they were looking at cortisol levels in the blood under different circumstances. And sometimes they would loan me out to other investigators. And in the Heart Institute, they were doing a lot of work with controlling hypertension at the time. And those people were on long term diets, like they got nothing but rice to eat for months. I mean, it was, I don't know how they did it.
Was it weird to live in this place where all these people were kind of getting poked and prodded or involved in studies or maybe even in pain sometimes?
I mean, it was happening to all our friends, and we compared notes and things, but it sort of became normal for us.
Laura Stark is a historian of medicine and science. She's well aware of the history of human subject research in the last century. So she started looking into the Normals Project with some assumptions about how human subjects in these experiments would feel about their experience.
I was shocked to find that they were happy. And it was a real problem for me to have happy human subjects. And it was the insistence of the people that I spoke with not to misrepresent them by saying that it was a terrible experience and they wish they hadn't done it. So, as a historian, trying to balance the history that is very dark and deals with also a lot of tied up histories of oppression and racism in the United States, but also globally, that how it would be possible to narrate a story of people who were actually quite happy that they did it. It was a meaningful experience. They made lots of great connections. Many of them made friendships with people whom they're still in touch with. Many of them met their spouses while they were normals. Was really difficult to try to fit it together and not turn their happy stories into negative ones.
I remember one time when I was driving from home back to the NIH after a weekend, and I picked up a sailor who was hitchhiking along the road. Just across the street from the National Institute of Health was the Navy Medical Center, and that's where he was going. I picked him up and took him along. I was explaining to him what I was doing, and he said, well, he wouldn't do that for anything. He'd rather be shot at. so, so it didn't appeal to everybody.
When I first heard about this project, people volunteering to be healthy subjects, living on campus, getting experimented on, I just kind of assumed that there would be exploitation, that it would be harmful to the people or they would not have the ability to control what's going on for them. And it's really surprising that, hearing from you and hearing from Laura that it was fine. It really didn't bother you?
No, first of all, I think I trusted the people that I knew. And there were a number of measures taken to make sure that things were safe and that some mad scientist wasn't going off and experimenting on us. There were committees that had to approve the studies. I was assigned a personal physician, and he had to approve. If somebody wanted to do a study on me, then he had to approve that. And I could always talk to him or talk to the other people if I had questions. And then the other thing, I met my wife. She was not a volunteer. She was nearby at a Baptist children's home, but we met because we were in that service.
Talking to these people, they seem so chipper. They seem like, looking back on it, kindly, fondly. How did you know it wasn't rose-colored glasses?
Their stories all taken together encouraged me to go back to the archival record and try to ask this question of how structurally, politically this could possibly be. It was by adopting sort of the mindset of the organizations that the people were coming through and not starting from the position of the history of medicine.
Laura realized that she had to think about the normal volunteers in this context in the 1950s as people eager to serve. As part of their religious beliefs, they saw what they were doing in such a different way than people who had suffered at the hands of experimenters in the past.
And so putting this in the broader structure of voluntary service was really important. You could see serving as a normal control as the equivalent of being a teacher, of being a farmhand, of being an assistant in a hospital. The other thing that the churches in particular, and thinking of it in this sort of structural way, is really important, is that the churches functioned as a quasi-union for the normals. They really did want to keep the people who were going through the churches safe and happy. And so when they were unhappy with NIH, the church leaders, they would actually, get feedback from the normals that they were sending, and then they would demand for changes at NIH. They asked for the doctors to be clearer about what research they were doing and what the normals could expect going in.
So they had powerful advocates on their side.
Exactly. And it was powerful advocates working collectively.
I felt that this was a time that really helped me feel more independent. So I think psychologically, I felt very positive about the summer and about myself. It was a good experience. I hope there was some contribution to science that you don't know at all.
That's a big question. Did the Normals program work? We'll find out next on episode 2 of our series, The Normals. The series was produced and hosted by me, Sarah Crespi. Our supervising producer is Kevin McLean. Audrey Quinn is our story editor. Laura Stark is our consultant. The Normal series was inspired by Laura's book, The Normals, A People's History of Modern America in 5 Human Experiments. Music for this episode was by Leah Simon, Cecilia Sanchetti, Lionel Cohen, Wen Koi Wen, and Bernie Messinger. Thanks for listening.